Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Subsection 1. Masterson was standing, a little before sunset, at the Great West Door of Hartley, nearly a month later, waiting for the arrival. His nose and mouth twitched a little as his manner was in apprehensive thought, and his eyes looked cross as he stared out at the straight ribbon of road, still empty of any vehicle. Behind him the house seemed as empty and dead quiet. To right and left of him the shrubbery stood like troops of watchers, russet behind, evergreen in front, and the whole arch of sky before and above him glowed with rose and amber. The household had had time to assimilate the news by now. It had been delivered to them with the appearance of miserable anger that had ended in choking emotion by Mr. Masterson himself 3 weeks ago, one day after dinner. On that day, at the moment when the 6 potentates of the servants' hall were accustomed to rise and file out, that they might partake of sweets in what was known as the steward's room, the 3 of them who were there sat still, all except Masterson, who rose to his feet, holding a letter in his hand. "Mrs. Fanning desires me to read you all this letter," he said, without comment or introduction. Then he had read it from the heading Elizabeth Street down to "Yours truly, Anna Fanning." He began, as had been said, with an air of wretched anger and sharpness. He ended with a number of curious sounds in his throat. Then the entire household had risen to its feet to speed the solemn line of 3 potentates, who went out in silence. An air of marked silence had deepened on the house. Even Jim had been subdued. He had said to Masterson one day in the pantry that he supposed it was not proper to ride on Charles's back just now. Masterson had agreed shortly. He rode out on his pony every day solemnly. He did his lessons with the governess from the vicarage at unusual hours. He went to tea 3 or 4 times with Mr. Morpeth, and once at the vicarage itself. He went to Mass on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and knelt all alone in the hall pew, very grave and observant. To those who truly love houses for themselves, it is perfectly evident that these have moods as marked as their personalities. Hartley was mourning, there could be no doubt about it. Mourning in a manner altogether inexplicable on the grounds that its inhabitants were sorrowful. There was a silence in it, as of meditation. When Jim forgot himself and shrieked with the collies on the lawn, the house appeared to lift its eyelids for an instant, and then drop them again. At night it seemed sleepless, during the day drowsy and thoughtful. The maids went swiftly and timidly along the gallery to open and shut the windows, as if fearing to disturb its deep contemplation. The gardeners looked up at it suddenly as if it had sighed, but it only looked at them as if brooding. Masterson was not the man to analyze his sensations, but as he stood here in the sunset light, he really did not know how to comport himself interiorly. Exteriorly, of course, all must be usual. He must step forward and open the car door when it came, with that indescribable inclination that asks for no acknowledgement. He must stand while the travelers went into the house, and then turn to the car to help Charleston with the rugs and the handbags. The bigger luggage had arrived by train and wagonette nearly an hour ago. He must then go back into the hall, and through it without a word. But his interior emotions were so mutually exclusive that he could make nothing of them at all. The master and mistress were coming back after a month's absence, and the master was coming back to die. Yet he would not be carried in like a dying man. So much Masterson had learned from the maids. He would be fully dressed. He could walk without support. He looked pulled down, of course, yet convalescent. What then were the emotions suitable to such a bewildering situation? Masterson shook his head slowly. That was perhaps the inevitable, and the best symbol. But his grief was genuine and deep. He was a very loving and faithful servant. He suddenly straightened himself as he saw far away on the straight drive in front a black object approaching. Subsection 2. The actual arrival was completely devoid of any sensational element. When the car was drawn up and Masterson opened the door, Mrs. Fanning, who was sitting nearest to it, smiled and nodded and came out. She turned when she reached the ground, yet not fussily. "How do you do, Masterson? All well?" said Neville as he came past. There was no more than that. Masterson said, "Yes, Sir Neville," and the boy went into the house. He was in the gray suit in which he had gone away. When 3 minutes later the butler went through the hall with the rugs and a bag, Mrs. Fanning called out and said they would have tea here at once. Neville was sitting on the sofa opening his letters, and his aunt standing by the fire drawing off her gloves. It would all have been completely natural and ordinary if only it had been possible for the butler to have said that he hoped Sir Neville was well. They were still in the same position when he brought in tea. Here, too, for the first time, Masterson saw the appearance of the boy's head. When the butler had once more gone, Neville looked up from opening his last letter. "Where's Jim?" he asked. "I arranged he should be out to tea with Mr. Morpeth, my dear," said Anna easily. "I thought perhaps you'd find him in the way for the first hour or two." Neville smiled, genuinely enough. "This won't do one little bit, my dear. Remember what we agreed on Monday? We must make no difference at all, none at all. We won't have any more funerals until we've got to." She glanced up and down again, and he saw a sharp pain in her eyes. "And you mustn't look like that," he said tranquilly. "Yes, please. 2 lumps, as usual." Aunt Anna was finding the situation hard in a completely unexpected way. She had arranged herself, of course, according to Mr. Morpeth's advice, and had determined that no weakness should come from her side. It was to be her part to accept things serenely, not to be sentimental, and to support her nephew steadily in the same attitude. But on the second occasion on which she had been allowed to see him in the nursing home, she had found him almost disconcertingly unsentimental himself. He had announced to her that he didn't want to talk about it any more at all, until it was absolutely necessary, that he had thought it all out, that he would talk necessary business later, that he was extraordinarily grateful for all her loving kindness, and would she be good enough to tell him when Charleston would be allowed to come up and give his clothes an overhauling? Since then he had talked with a geniality that very nearly amounted to hardness. It was disconcerting, she thought, when you have screwed yourself up to a difficult attitude in order to help someone else, to find that the someone else had already assumed the same attitude with hardly any difficulty at all. He had discussed with her what he would be allowed to do when he got back to Hartley. He had told her that Sir Arthur Hansworth had informed him that the headaches would recur within a couple of months, and that thence until the end there would have to be a good deal of morphia. He had begun a few sentences as to the future of Hartley, and had broken off before finishing them. He had said that he very much wanted to see Mr. Morpeth as soon as it was convenient, after the return to Hartley, and he had done a little business with a typist whom he had caused to come in for an hour each morning so soon as it was allowed. He looked almost shockingly natural now, as he slipped his feet up on the sofa after finishing his cup of tea, and leaned back staring up at the ceiling. Of course he did not look as he had looked 6 weeks ago. His tan was gone, and there was a certain gauntness about his temples and shoulders, as well as a few hollows and lines in his face. But she had seen him constantly, and these things were not startling. It appeared then almost shocking that he should look so nearly himself to one who knew what Aunt Anna knew. Presently he yawned. "I'm dog-tired," he observed. "Carriage exercise, I suppose. Aunt Anna?" "Yes, my dear?" "There are some things to be fetched from the station tomorrow, and a couple of workmen. Do you mind seeing that the dog cart and the farm cart go in to meet the 10:14? "Why, yes, my dear, of course. But what—" "I'm not going to tell you," he said. "Wait till you see. And I want someone from the village who can build." "Who is there?" She mentioned a local workman. "Then I want him too, at the same time. No, really, I won't tell you. It's just something I want done in the garden. You'll approve, I think." His eyes twinkled at her pleasantly, then he yawned again. I want lots of things. Where's Father Richardson? And I want Jim and Mr. Morpeth." "I wrote to him 2 days ago. He'll be coming tomorrow morning, I expect." "That's all right then. I'll see him, if I may, as soon as he comes. By the way, Aunt Anna?" "Yes?" "Just say something to Masterson, will you? Tell him I mustn't have any scenes, that I want everything to be exactly as usual. As I said, I don't want any funerals at all just yet. There are some things we shall have to talk about, of course, but we'll do them by degrees. I think Father Richardson is the first." "Do you want to see him?" "I want," said Neville quite deliberately, "to tell him in your presence that I'm sorry for the extraordinarily disagreeable way I behaved to him in the pavilion that day in the summer, you know, and that I behaved even more disagreeably about him after he'd gone." "But, my dear—" "Don't be afraid, Aunt Anna. I'm not going to be melodramatic and Sunday evening-ish, and have reconciliations and all that. And I'm not going to take back about his not running in here as he likes. That wouldn't be fair on you, but I must just say that, you know, and have done with it. Then I must see Cunningham about the estate. That'll take hours, I suppose. and then I want to have several long conversations with Jim. But I think we'll put that off for the present. I'm making Maresfield one of his trustees, you know, as I told you." "Yes," she said. "I'm glad. I like him." "Well," went on Neville, "how about Father Richardson coming to dinner tonight?" "But, my dear boy, I thought you were to go to bed early and—" "After tonight I will. But I want to have one decent evening first. Let's pretend that I'm not going to die for once." She could not speak for a moment. It seemed to her that he was surely callous. Was he going after all to die defiantly? But he went on, as if he knew her thoughts. "My dear, you must let me do it my way. Don't think me a brute. I'm not meaning to be." Subsection 3. It was with considerable inward apprehensiveness that Father Richardson, in his cassock and long French coat, stood and rang at the front doorbell at 5 minutes before 8 that same evening. He had had exactly the proper kind of letter from Mrs. Fanning, announcing the news, and had written exactly the proper kind of letter back in response. All was perfectly correct. Then he had heard scraps of information from time to time, and had at last heard only this morning that they were expected back that afternoon. Then on his return from the village he had found Mrs. Fanning's note. He was apprehensive at first because he did not know in the least in what state he would find his host, and secondly, because he did not know what to say to him. He was perfectly competent in his confessional, that is to say, he would always give the proper answer founded on the soundest principles. But this was not the same thing as to make suitable remarks under social circumstances. It was all the more impossible to decide upon what he should say, owing to his ignorance of how he should find his squire. It was a piece of information, at any rate, to know that Neville would be at dinner. But he was not prepared to be greeted by Neville in the hall. At least he had pictured to himself an invalid's chair. Neville certainly looked gaunt and thin, and the top of his head looked odd somehow. The priest could not see more than that. But he was in evening clothes, and actually standing on the hearth as his guest came in. Mrs. Fanning was not there. "How do you do, Father? So glad you could come on such short notice. Oh, here is Aunt Anna." A rustle sounded overhead. "We took nearly 3 hours to come down," he went on. "Can't bear speed just yet, you know. Here's Father Richardson, Aunt Anna." The two shook hands. "And look here, Father," proceeded Neville, still standing with his back to the fire. "Business first, before we go into dinner. I want just to apologize to you quite simply for my behavior in the pavilion one day, soon after I came back from Rome. You remember, no doubt. Well, I shouldn't have spoken like that. I'm sorry. My aunt was there, so I wanted her to be here too, and I apologized. That's all. I'm sure you forgive me. Let's talk about something else." The priest was taken completely aback. He had met with frankness from Neville when he had first come to Hartley. Slight constraint had followed gradually, and finally the little scene in the pavilion. From that time there had been courtesy, but nothing else. That frankness should ever again exist in their relations was an inconceivable thought. Certainly the priest could not have done it himself, but beyond that, he could not imagine anyone else doing it. It will be remembered, possibly, that one of his principles was never to apologize. "I am sure, Sir Neville," he began. "My dear Father, I know you forgive me. Probably you had forgotten it long ago. In any case, let us forget it now. At least, I hope you will try to." The priest opened his lips and closed them again, and simultaneously Masterson threw open the dining-room door and announced dinner. Conversation was exceedingly difficult, so soon as they sat down and the priest had said grace, he asked dutifully after his host's health. "Thanks very much, Father. I'm first-rate," said Neville shortly. "Got to lie up, you know, and take things easily. But I thought I'd have my own way tonight for once. How perfectly charming the place is looking." His tone did not encourage any further discussion of his health. They talked of this and that, and the beautiful old room about the round table. Neville made some remarks about his pheasants. Aunt Anna, whenever a pause came, slipped in a small and appropriate topic, and Father Richardson did his best. But Neville's health, even after the shocking announcement made by letter to the priest by Mrs. Fanning a month ago, never recurred. Two alternative conclusions began to form themselves in Father Richardson's mind. The first was that the announcement had been gravely exaggerated, that Mrs. Fanning had written excitedly and from imperfect information, and that the matter was not nearly so serious as had first been thought. The second, that Neville was so morbidly terrified of the prospect before him that he would allow no mention of it at all. These two conclusions came up before the priest's mind, now one, now the other, and he could not decide as to which was the more likely. But surely he must find out, he thought, for plainly it was his duty to be of service to this spiritual son of his. He did not relish the prospect, but he had that kind of courage which a conscientious and rather timid man can always summon up, and he determined to probe as soon as an opportunity presented itself. It came immediately after Mrs. Fanning had left the dining room. Neville came back from closing the door after her, pushed the port across to the priest, and sat down without speaking. Certainly he looked extraordinarily tired, but not worse than the other had seen him before now. Here then was his chance. He helped himself to a glass of port. "Sir Neville," he said, "may I say something?" The other looked up quickly and almost sharply. "Why, certainly, Father." "Is it possible that Mrs. Fanning's report to me was exaggerated? You seem so much better than I could have imagined from what she said, that I hoped... Again the young man looked up, but he did not speak. "Well, I hoped perhaps that you might really be on the road to recovery." He did not quite like the expression on his host's face. There was a curious musing look in his eyes that appeared to be considering the other's features. The priest told himself he must be courageous. "If that is not so," he said, "I was wondering whether perhaps you would not care to have a talk with me. I have noticed—" "Yes, Father? What have you noticed?" "Well, Sir Neville, I'm your parish priest, you know, and it is my duty—" "Father, I know that. Please tell me what you have noticed." There was nothing in the least offensive or peremptory in the young man's tone, but the priest was conscious of a quickening of his pulses. It was really rather like the beginning of that unhappy little scene in the pavilion. "I have noticed that you have not been to the sacraments," he said bravely, certainly not since last Easter. I suppose you went to Holy Communion then, as every Catholic is bound to do, but—" Neville stood up, and the priest stopped short. He was certain a scene was coming. There was an air of tenseness in his host's face he did not like. He looked tactfully down at the tablecloth. "Father, I must ask your pardon again. I am rather irritable, I am afraid nowadays. You have done quite rightly in speaking to me. Well, I can reassure you, I went to the sacraments on the day of my operation, and I have been every week since. I propose to go on with that now that I am home again. Shall we go into the hall and have a cigarette?" And your health, Sir Neville? I suppose from what you say— "My health? Well, I shall certainly be dead before Easter, probably much earlier. You will pray for me, will you not? I think I hear coffee coming. Shall we have it in the hall?" "My dear," said Neville as he took up his bedroom candlestick, "I very nearly lost my temper again, and I was really entirely wrong this time. I forgot that I was one of his sheep, and only remembered that I was entertaining him. But he's a good little man, and only did his duty."